He was a man drowning on dry land, wearing his loneliness like heavy armor 15 miles from the nearest soul. In the late autumn of 1889, this dilapidated ranch was meant to be his tomb, a place where he could starve himself among the ghosts of his past. He hired a cook hoping for a ghost, but instead he got a warrior. When the 6-foot-tall Navajo woman stepped off the wagon, the ground beneath them shifted. He tried to hide in the weathered barn, sending trembling, crumpled notes to avoid her gaze, but she refused to let him wither away in silence. This wasn't just a job, it was a battle for a life that desperately wanted to end. Thorne Caldwell looked less like a living man and more like a cautionary tale carved out of bone and regret. At 45 years old, his gaunt frame was a map of self-inflicted starvation, his hollow cheeks hidden beneath a graying, unkempt beard that hadn't seen a razor since the funeral he refused to speak of. He stood in the shadows of the weathered barn, watching through a crack in the rotting wood as the wagon rattled away, leaving a cloud of dust and a stranger standing on his porch. He had hired a cook because he was too weak to open a can of beans, not because he wanted company. He wanted a ghost, someone who would slide plates under the door and disappear into the woodwork. But as the dust settled at Echoing Dust Ranch, Thorne realized with a sinking feeling in his gut that he had made a terrible miscalculation. The person standing there wasn't a ghost. She was an anchor, and she was about to drag him back to the surface whether he wanted to breathe or not. Hit the like button right now if you believe some walls are meant to be broken. Kizikoni Ki Strongbow did not look like the type of woman who took orders from a man hiding in a barn. At 34, she stood 6 feet tall, a statue of resolve cast in bronze. Her long black hair was tied back, practical and severe, revealing piercing dark eyes that scanned the dilapidated property with the precision of a hawk hunting in tall grass. She saw the peeling paint, the sagging porch, and the overwhelming aura of neglect that clung to the ranch like a disease. Most people would have turned around and chased the wagon back to Solitude Springs. Key just tightened her grip on her carpet bag and marched up the steps. The wood groaned under her boots, a sound that echoed across the 15 miles of emptiness separating them from civilization. She wasn't just here to cook. She had seen men like Thorne before, men who thought that if they stood still enough, death would mistake them for trees and take them gently. She stepped into the house, and the war for Thorne's soul began before the door even clicked shut. Thorne retreated deeper into the barn, his sanctuary of splinters and drafts. He lay on a makeshift cot that smelled of horsehair and old hay, his heart hammering against ribs that were far too prominent. He grabbed a scrap of paper, his hands trembling with a weakness he told himself was just the cold of late autumn, 1889. He scribbled a note, the graphite snapping under the pressure of his anxiety. Leave food on the porch. Do not enter the barn. I require no conversation. He crumpled the note, smoothed it out, and then crumpled it again before walking to the farmhouse under the cover of twilight to pin it to the back door. He was a man drowning on dry land, terrified that this Navajo woman would try to be a lifeguard. He didn't want saving. He wanted to fade out, to become just another whisper in the wind that howled through the canyons. But Key was not the wind. She was the mountain that forced the wind to change direction. Inside the kitchen, Key found the cast-iron skillet. It was rusted, neglected, much like the owner of this cursed property. She scrubbed it until her knuckles were raw, seasoning it with a determination that bordered on aggression. Within an hour, the smell of frying bacon and baking bread began to seep through the cracks of the house, drifting across the yard and invading the sterile, cold air of the barn. It was a weaponized aroma. To a starving man, it was torture. Thorne covered his face with his arm, trying to block out the scent of life. He had spent months surviving on hardtack and water, punishing himself for sins that only he could see. Now, the air smelled like forgiveness, and it made him sick with guilt. He ignored the first meal. He ignored the second. He stayed in the barn, shivering, listening to the sounds of Kee moving around his house, her footsteps heavy and deliberate. She was cleaning. She was organizing. She was erasing the shrine to misery he had spent so years building. What would you do if a stranger tried to save you from yourself? Let us know in the comments below. The silent war escalated over the next 3 days. The notes became Thorne's only voice. "On too much salt," he lied in one scrawled message, leaving a full plate of perfectly roasted venison on the porch step for the coyotes. "Do not touch the study," read another, after he saw her dusting the window of the room where he used to be happy. Kee read the notes with a stoic expression, her dark eyes narrowing. She didn't reply with paper. She replied with escalation. If he didn't eat the stew, she baked a pie. If he didn't eat the pie, she roasted a chicken. She was laying siege to his hunger, banking on the biological imperative that eventually the body would betray the mind. But Thorne was stubborn. His gaunt frame grew thinner, his movements in the yard slower. He was winning the battle to kill himself, and Kee realized that polite persistence was going to result in a funeral. She watched him from the kitchen window, stumbling as he tried to fix a fence post, his strength failing him completely. He looked like a ghost haunting his own life. Kee wiped her hands on her apron, her patience snapping like a dry twig. She wasn't a servant hired to cater a wake. She was a human being watching another human being commit suicide in slow motion. She grabbed the cast-iron skillet, not to cook, but because she needed to hold something heavy to ground herself. She marched out the back door, ignoring the imaginary line Thorne had drawn in the dust. She crossed the yard, her boots kicking up clouds of dirt, heading straight for the weathered barn. Thorne heard her coming. The rhythm of her stride was different this time. It wasn't the careful walk of a woman bringing a tray. It was the stomp of a woman bringing a reckoning. He scrambled off his cot, trying to look busy, trying to look alive, but he barely had the strength to stand. The barn door flew open, slamming against the wall with a violence that shook dust from the rafters. Light flooded the dark space, blinding Thorne. Silhouette against the afternoon sun, Kee looked 10 feet tall. She stepped inside, the temperature in the barn seeming to rise with her presence. Thorne opened his mouth to bark an order, to tell her to leave, to point to his crumpled notes, but the look in her eyes strangled the words in his throat. She didn't look at him with pity. She looked at him with fury. She saw the hollow cheeks, the trembling hands, the way his clothes hung off him like laundry on a wire line. She saw the man hiding behind the beard, and the guilt. "You think you're punishing yourself," Kee said, her voice low and steady, cutting through the silence he cherished. "But you're just being a coward. Starving isn't penance, Mr. Caldwell. It's just quitting." Thorne staggered back, leaning against a support beam. "You don't know anything," he rasped, his voice sounding like grinding stones. "You're here to cook. If you can't follow orders, get back on the wagon." "There is no wagon." Kee stepped closer, invading his space, forcing him to look up at her. "And I don't cook for corpses. You eat what I make tonight, or I burn this barn down with you in it. I didn't come 15 miles to watch a man feel sorry for himself while he wastes good meat. Make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the turning point of this story." Thorne stared at her, stunned. No one had spoken to him like that in years. The shock of it jolted his system more than any food could have. He wanted to yell, to fire her, to drive her off the property, but his legs gave out. He slid down the wooden beam, hitting the dirt floor with a thud. He expected her to leave, to walk away in disgust. Instead, Kee knelt. Her expression softened, just a fraction, shifting from lethal efficiency to something deeper, something rooted in her own survival. She reached out, not to help him up, but to place a hand on his shoulder. The contact was electric. He hadn't been touched by another human being in so long that he flinched. "The ghosts won't leave just because you die, Thorn," she whispered, using his first name for the first time. "They just get lonely." For a moment the silence returned, but it was different now. It wasn't empty, it was heavy with a choice. Thorn looked at her, really looked at her, and saw that she was fighting demons of her own, hiding them behind that wall of strength. He was about to speak, to perhaps accept the lifeline she was throwing, when a sound cut through the air outside. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the settling of the old house, it was the distinct, metallic click of a lever-action rifle being cocked. Guy froze. Her hand tightened on his shoulder. The lethal efficiency returned to her eyes instantly. She stood up slowly, positioning herself between Thorn and the open barn door. Thorn's confusion turned to cold dread. He thought he could keep running from the world, but he was wrong. He didn't know that in the tall grass of the fence line, a danger from his past had been waiting for him to get weak enough to take. The countdown had already begun, and now he didn't just have to save himself, he had to figure out how to save the woman standing in the line of fire, like subscribe and turn on notifications for the conclusion. The metallic click was followed by a silence so profound it felt like the air had been sucked out of the weathered barn. Key did not flinch. Her stillness was not born of fear, but of a predator assessing a threat. She remained standing between Thorn and the sliver of daylight cutting through the open door, her silhouette a defiant shield against the unknown. Thorn, slumped against the rough timber of the support beam, felt his heart hammer against his ribs, a frantic rhythm that his starved body could barely sustain. He tried to push himself up, his fingers clawing at the dirt, but his muscles were water. The weakness he had cultivated, the slow death he had courted, was now a shackle preventing him from protecting the only person who had tried to save him. A voice drifted in from the tall grass, carried on the biting autumn wind. It was rough, amused, and terrifyingly familiar. It called out for Thorn to step out, mocking his silence, taunting the ghost he had become. Thorn recognized the gravelly timbre immediately. It belonged to a man named Silas, a vulture who had circled the echoing dust ranch for years, waiting for the inevitable decay to set in. Silas knew Thorn was alone. He knew the ranch was a husk. What he did not know was that a 6-foot-tall Navajo woman was currently scanning the barn for a way out, her eyes dark with calculation. Key turned to Thorn, her voice a harsh whisper that brooked no argument. She demanded to know if there were weapons in the barn. Thorn shook his head, shame burning in his chest. He had removed everything sharp, everything lethal, months ago. A bullet shattered the silence and the doorframe simultaneously. Wood splinters exploded inward, showering Key's long black hair with dust. She dropped to a crouch instantly, moving with a fluidity that made Thorn feel ancient. She scrambled over to him, grabbing the fabric of his shirt with iron fingers. She told him they had to move, that the barn was a coffin. Thorn tried to protest, to tell her to leave him, to save herself, but she was already hauling him up. Her strength was shocking. She leveraged her height and power to drag him toward the back of the barn, away from the exposed doorway. Another shot punched through the rotting wood, whistling past Thorn's ear, a deadly reminder that his penance was over and his punishment had truly begun. They reached the rear wall, where a loose plank offered a narrow escape route. He kicked the wood free, the sound masked by a third shot from the unseen rifleman. The cold air hit Thorn's face, sharp and reviving. Outside, the tall grass of the fence line swayed violently in the wind, offering a precarious cover. The main house stood 50 yards away, a fortress of peeling paint and broken memories. It seemed miles away to Thorn's trembling legs. Key looked at him, her dark eyes locking onto his. She told him to run. Not for himself, but because if he fell, she would have to stop to carry him, and that would kill them both. It was a brutal truth, delivered with the necessary cruelty to spark adrenaline in a dying engine. Thorn nodded, gritting his teeth. He pushed off the barn wall and stumbled into the grass. The world tilted, his vision blurred at the edges, grey spots dancing in his eyes. He focused on the back porch of the ranch house. Every step was a battle against gravity and atrophy. He could hear Kee behind him, moving low and fast, her breathing controlled. A shout erupted from the fence line. They had been spotted. The crack of the rifle was louder now, unmasked by walls. Dirt kicked up inches from Thorn's boot. He lunged forward, adrenaline temporarily overriding the starvation, and crashed onto the wooden slats of the porch. Kee was there a second later, shoving him through the back door and slamming it shut, throwing the heavy iron bolt. The interior of the house was dim and smelled of stale air and neglect. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light, piercing through the shuttered windows. Thorn collapsed against the kitchen island, gasping for air, his lungs burning as if he had swallowed fire. He slid down to the floor, clutching his chest. Kee did not rest. She moved through the kitchen, her boots echoing on the floorboards. She grabbed the heavy cast-iron skillet from the stove, the same one she had used to cook the meals he refused to eat, and weighed it in her hand, a makeshift weapon for a desperate stand. She peered through a crack in the window shutters, scanning the yard. She reported that there were 3 of them, maybe 4. They were moving closer, emboldened by the lack of return fire. Thorn looked up at her, seeing the fierce determination in her profile. He realized with a sickening jolt that she was prepared to die defending a man who had already given up. The guilt that had been drowning him suddenly solidified into something else. Anger. Not at himself, but at the men outside who dared to threaten her. He rasped out a command. Under the floorboards in the hallway, the loose one near the grandfather clock. Kee looked at him, understanding dawning in her eyes. She dropped the skillet and ran to the hallway. Thorn heard the groan of wood being pried up, followed by the heavy clank of metal. She returned a moment later, holding a dusty, oil-wrapped bundle. She unfolded the cloth to reveal a pair of Colt revolvers and a box of ammunition. They were ghosts of his past life, weapons he had sworn never to touch again after the accident that had hollowed him out. But the past was here, knocking on the door with rifle butts. Kee checked the cylinders with practiced ease. They were empty. She began to load them, her hands steady, the brass cartridges clicking into place with a rhythm that sounded like a ticking clock. She handed one of the heavy pistols to Thorn. He stared at the gun in his lap. The cold steel felt alien against his palm, yet his fingers remembered the grip. It was a heavy weight, heavier than he remembered. Outside, Silas shouted again, his voice closer now, right on the front porch. He called out that he knew Thorn was in there, that he was just going to strike a match and burn the rat out of its hole. The threat hung in the air, terrifyingly real. The house was a tinderbox of dry wood and old paper. Kee crouched beside Thorn. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She didn't tell him it would be okay. She simply told him that if he couldn't stand, he needed to aim from the floor. She told him to breathe. She positioned herself at the window, the revolver raised, waiting for a target. Thorn looked at her back. She was a stranger who had stepped off a wagon into his personal hell and decided to redecorate with hope and violence. He couldn't let her burn. He forced his thumb to pull back the hammer. The click was loud in the quiet kitchen. Thorn shifted, fighting the tremors in his arm. He propped his elbow on his knee to steady the weapon. He wasn't the man he used to be. He was a shadow, a husk, but even a shadow can pull a trigger. The front door handle rattled violently. Then came the heavy thud of a boot against the wood. The lock strained. Dust rained down from the doorframe. Kee glanced back at him just for a second. Her eyes were blazing. She whispered that they weren't dying today. It wasn't a question. It was an order. The front door splintered open with a crash, flooding the hallway with blinding afternoon light. A silhouette stepped into the frame, a rifle raised. Thorn didn't think. He didn't hesitate. He let the instinct buried under years of grief take over. He raised the pistol, the sights aligning with the center of the mass in the doorway, and the deafening roar of the Colt filled the house, drowning out the ghosts that had screamed in his head for so long. The silhouette jerked back, crumbling to the porch, but the victory was short-lived. A barrage of gunfire erupted from the yard, shattering the windows and sending glass flying across the kitchen like deadly confetti. Key returned fire, her shots measured and precise, forcing the attackers to scramble for cover. Thorne dragged himself across the floor, seeking a better angle, ignoring the shards of glass cutting into his hands. The siege had begun. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in a house that was barely standing. But for the first time in years, Thorne Caldwell wasn't trying to die. He was fighting to live. The silent war he had waged against himself was over. The loud war for survival had just commenced. And in the smoke-filled haze of the kitchen, looking at the warrior woman holding the line, he realized that the walls he had built to keep the world out were the only things standing between them and oblivion. The bullets chewed through the clappered siding of the ranch house with a sound like angry hornets, turning the once quiet sanctuary into a chaotic storm of splinters and dust. Thorne scrambled behind the overturned heavy oak table, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. His body, weakened by months of self-imposed starvation, screamed in protest at the sudden exertion, but his mind was sharpening with every crack of a rifle from the yard. Beside him, Key moved with the fluidity of water, reloading her revolver with steady hands that betrayed no fear, only a cold calculation of the odds. She didn't look at him with pity anymore. She looked at him as a partner in a trench. The siege was relentless. Silas and his men had surrounded the perimeter, their shouts taunting Thorne, promising a slow end if he didn't surrender the deed to the land. Thorne peeked over the edge of the table, firing 2 shots toward the broken window where a hat had bobbed into view. A yelp of pain confirmed a hit, but it was answered by a volley that shattered the remaining glass in the kitchen cabinets, sending shards raining down onto the floor like jagged hail. The house, which Thorne had treated as a tomb for so long, was being dismantled piece by piece. He realized with a jolt of clarity that he didn't care about the wood or the walls. He cared about the woman crouching beside him. Key had come here to cook, to clean, to save a man who didn't want saving, and now she was bleeding from a shallow cut on her cheek, fighting his war. The guilt that had paralyzed him for years suddenly transformed into a cold, hard rage. Smoke began to curl under the front door, thick and acrid. They were torching the porch. The realization hit them both simultaneously. If they stayed, they would burn. If they ran, they would be cut down in the open. Key looked at the back door, then at the barn standing 50 yards away across the open yard. It was a gauntlet of death, but the barn offered high ground and heavy timber cover. It was where Thorne had spent his nights hiding from the world, and now it was their only chance to survive it. He nodded to her, a silent agreement passing between them. He would draw their fire. It was suicide, but he was the one who was supposed to be dead anyway. Thorne surged to his feet, not with the grace of a hero, but with the desperation of a dying animal cornered. He kicked the back door open and roared, a sound that tore from his throat and surprised even him. He fired wildly toward the fence line, suppressing the gunman just enough to create a window. Key didn't hesitate. She sprinted across the dry earth, her long skirt kicking up dust, moving toward the barn. Thorne followed, his legs pumping, his lungs burning as if he had swallowed hot coals. A bullet tugged at his sleeve, another kicked dirt into his eyes, but he kept moving. He felt the impact of a slug slamming into his shoulder, spinning him around, but the adrenaline was a powerful drug. He crashed into the barn door, tumbling onto the straw-covered floor just as Key slammed the heavy wood shut and dropped the locking bar into place. Darkness swallowed them, sliced only by the beams of light cutting through the gaps in the weathered planks. Thorne lay on the ground, clutching his shoulder. It was a flesh wound, deep and bleeding, But the bone held. Key was there instantly, tearing a strip from her apron to bind it tight. Her hands were rough but gentle, her eyes scanning his face for signs of surrender. She found none. The man who had trembled at the sight of a plate of food was gone. In his place was a spectre of vengeance, gaunt and grey, but undeniably alive. The barn, usually a place of cold isolation where he slept on a cot to avoid the warmth of a home, now felt like a fortress. Outside, the shouting grew closer. Silas knew they were trapped. The heavy thud of boots surrounded the structure. They were toying with them now, confident in their victory. Thorne pulled himself up, using a pitchfork to steady his stance. He knew this barn better than he knew himself. He knew which boards creaked, which shadows were deep enough to hide a man. He motioned for Key to climb the ladder to the loft. She would take the high ground. He would hold the floor. It was a tactical pincer, born of necessity. The barn doors shook as a battering ram hit them. Once, twice, the wood groaned, splintering under the assault. Thorne stood in the center of the open space, the revolver heavy in his left hand, his right arm useless at his side. He looked like a ghost, his hollow cheeks shadowed, his beard matted with dust and sweat. When the doors finally gave way, crashing inward with a cloud of debris, Silas stepped in, silhouetted against the burning ranch house behind him. He laughed, a cruel, wet sound, raising his rifle to finish the job. He didn't see the shadow in the loft. Key fired from above. The shot took Silas in the leg, dropping him to one knee. Chaos erupted. Two more men rushed in behind Silas, guns blazing toward the loft. Thorne stepped from the shadows, his pistol barking. He dropped the first man with a shot to the chest. The second man turned, firing blindly, and a bullet grazed Thorne's hip, sending him stumbling back against the stall. Silas, screaming in pain and rage, leveled his rifle at Thorne. This was the moment, the choice between the void and the pain of living. Thorne looked down the barrel of the rifle and didn't blink. He lunged, not away from the danger, but toward it. He collided with Silas, the rifle discharging harmlessly into the roof. They grappled in the dirt, a desperate, ugly struggle. Silas was heavier, stronger, well-fed. Thorne was a skeleton held together by grief. But Thorne had something Silas didn't. He had nothing left to lose, and for the first time, something to protect. He fought with the ferocity of the damned. His hand found a heavy iron horseshoe lying in the muck. With a guttural cry that expelled the last of his demons, he brought it down. The struggle ceased. Silence rushed back into the barn, heavier than before. The only sound was the crackling of the fire consuming the house outside and the ragged breathing of the two survivors. Key climbed down from the loft, her boots soft on the straw. She walked over to where Thorne sat, slumped against a wooden post, blood soaking his shirt, his chest heaving. She didn't say a word. She simply knelt beside him and placed a hand on his uninjured shoulder. The touch grounded him. It pulled him back from the edge of the adrenaline crash. They limped out of the barn together as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of purple and orange. The ranch house was gone, reduced to a smoldering skeleton of timber. The physical manifestation of his past, the mausoleum he had built for his memories, was ash. Thorne watched it burn, and strangely he felt lighter. The ghosts that had screamed in the hallways were gone, carried away by the smoke. They sat on the water trough, watching the twilight settle over the valley. The danger in the tall grass had been neutralized. The countdown had reached 0, and they were still standing. Key reached into her pocket and pulled out something she had saved from the kitchen before the chaos began. A piece of dried biscuit. She broke it in half and offered a piece to him. It wasn't a request this time. It wasn't a note left on a table. It was communion. Thorne took the biscuit. His hand trembled, not from fear, but from exhaustion. He looked at the food, then at the woman who had refused to let him fade away. He took a bite. It was dry and tasteless, but to him it tasted like victory. It tasted like tomorrow. He chewed slowly, swallowing the lump in his throat. He looked at Key, really looked at her, seeing the fatigue etched around her eyes, the soot on her face. "Thank you," he rasped, his voice sounding rusty from disuse. Key looked out at the darkening horizon, a small, weary smile touching her lips. "Don't thank me yet," she said softly. "You have a ranch to rebuild, and I'm going to need a new kitchen." Thorn followed her gaze. The echoing dust ranch was destroyed, but the land remained. The soil was still there, waiting. He wasn't drowning on dry land anymore. He had found his footing. The winter would be hard, and the work would be brutal, but as the first star appeared in the vast, open sky, Thorn Caldwell knew one thing for certain. He was hungry, and for the first time in a long time, he was ready for the next course. Hit like if you're glad she saved him, and subscribe for more incredible rescue stories.